The chipped mug warmed my hands, the cheap ceramic a stark contrast to the delicate china I'd left behind. Steam rose, carrying the scent of instant coffee, another small change in a life recently overturned. Outside my small window, the city hummed, indifferent and anonymous. It was a comforting sound, the sound of not being needed, not being watched, not being judged as a burden. That word. It echoed sometimes in the quiet moments between the city's breaths, a cold whisper from a life I'd meticulously dismantled. They said it, my daughter Chloe, her voice laced with that practiced, weary patience she used when explaining something obvious to me. My son Mark hadn't said it aloud, but his silence, the way he'd looked away, his jaw tight, had been louder than any shout. And Daniel, Chloe's husband, the charming financial advisor who always seemed to advise everyone but himself into sensible decisions, he'd nodded along, a flicker of something relief, calculation. In his eyes, a burden after everything. After the years of propping them up, smoothing things over, being the ever-present, ever-ready safety net they'd all grown so comfortable bouncing on. The irony was thick enough to taste, bitter like the dregs of this cheap coffee. They thought I was the weight holding them down. They had no idea I was the only thing keeping them afloat. They were about to find out. The registered letter confirming the commencement of foreclosure proceedings on their house, the house I'd poured my life, my inheritance, and my dwindling savings into, was probably sitting in their pristine, unread mail pile right now. Along with the final demand notice for the consolidated loan I'd refused to co-sign one last time. Let them call me a burden now. Let them see what real weight feels like. The house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a monument to my quiet sacrifices. My parents had left it to me, free and clear, a beautiful old Victorian with stained glass windows and a wraparound porch where I'd spent countless summer evenings as a child. When Robert, my late husband, passed away far too young, leaving me with two teenagers and a mountain of unexpected debt he'd hidden with practiced ease, the house became my sanctuary, my only real asset. Chloe was 16 then, Mark 14. They were grieving, yes, but even then there was a sense of expectation. That I would handle it, that I would make it okay. And I did. I worked 2 jobs, clipped coupons until my fingers bled ink, learned to fix leaky faucets and patch drywall myself because calling a professional was a luxury we couldn't afford. I kept that house pristine, kept their lives as stable as I could, shielded them from the harsh realities Robert's irresponsibility had thrust upon us. I thought I was teaching them resilience, the value of hard work. Looking back, maybe I was just teaching them that mom would always fix it. Mom would always absorb the blow. Mom would always pay the price. When Chloe finished university, thanks to scholarships I'd spent weeks researching and applying for, and the steady drain on my meager savings, she met Daniel. He was smooth, ambitious, full of talk about portfolios and investments, things that sounded impressive but seemed to my cautious ears built on shifting sands. He moved into the house almost immediately. It made sense, Chloe had argued. Save money for their future. Why pay rent when mom had all this space? I remember the first pang of unease, a tiny voice whispering that my sanctuary was being invaded, but I silenced it. She was my daughter. I wanted her happy. Daniel's belongings seemed to multiply overnight, filling closets, the spare room becoming his home office. He had expensive tastes, gadgets, designer clothes, weekend trips they couldn't quite afford but justified as networking opportunities. Mark followed a different path, less overtly ambitious, more prone to drifting. He tried various jobs, never settling, always finding reasons why things didn't work out, a difficult boss, unfair expectations, needing time to find himself. He moved back in after a messy breakup, occupying the attic room, his presence marked by late-night gaming sounds and empty takeout containers. He was quieter than Chloe and Daniel, but his needs were just as constant: help with rent when he moved out briefly, money for car repairs, loans that were never repaid. He just needed a little help getting back on his feet, he'd say, over and over again. It became the family mantra: Mom will help. Mom has the house. Mom has, well, they never seemed quite sure what I had other than an endless capacity to provide. They saw the big house, the lack of a mortgage payment because I owned it outright, and assumed I was comfortable. They never saw the fraying cuffs on my work blouses, the ancient car I kept coaxing back to life, the careful budgeting that allowed me to stretch every single dollar. They didn't see the opportunities I'd passed up: travel, hobbies, even just a comfortable retirement fund, because their needs always came first. The house, my symbol of security, became their symbol of entitlement. It was Mom's house, it was the family house, a resource to be tapped. And I, the steward of that resource, was becoming inconvenient, an obstacle to their plans, a reminder perhaps of their own dependencies. The resentment started subtly, little comments about my old-fashioned ways, suggestions that perhaps the house was too much for me to manage alone. Daniel especially would talk about leveraging assets, about unlocking the equity tied up in the property. For their future, of course. Always for their future. The simmering resentment finally boiled over during what was supposed to be a celebratory dinner. Chloe had received a minor promotion, and Daniel insisted we go out to a restaurant far fancier than anything I would have chosen. He ordered expensive wine, appetizers, the most extravagant entrees, waving away the menu with a practiced air of nonchalance that always set my teeth on edge. Chloe basked in his reflected glory, while Mark seemed unusually tense, fidgeting with his silverware. The conversation inevitably turned to finances, Daniel lamenting the state of the market, the difficulty of getting ahead, the sheer cost of living. It was a familiar refrain, usually leading up to a request veiled as casual conversation. We were thinking, Mom, Chloe began, swirling her wine, avoiding my gaze, about the house. Here it comes, I thought, bracing myself. It's just such a huge asset. Daniel jumped in smoothly, sitting there, not really working for anyone. What are you suggesting, Daniel? I asked, keeping my voice level though my stomach tightened. We've been looking at investment properties, he continued, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. There's this incredible opportunity, a duplex downtown, guaranteed rental income. But the banks, they want more collateral. And you think my house is collateral? The words were sharper than I intended. Chloe winced. Mom, it's not like that, she said quickly. It's just we could leverage it. Take out a home equity loan. It would benefit all of us in the long run. We could even give you a small percentage of the rental income. A small percentage of the income generated by borrowing against my home. The home my parents left me. The home I kept safe for decades through sheer grit. No, I said quietly, firmly. The house is not collateral for your investments. Daniel's smile tightened. Margaret, be reasonable. It's a smart financial move. You're being overly sentimental. It's my home, Daniel, and it's paid for. I won't put it at risk. Mark suddenly spoke up, his voice strained. But Mom, we need this. I need this. I looked at him, surprised. What do you mean, Mark? He wouldn't meet my eyes. I owe some money, a lot of money. This investment thing, Daniel said it could help clear my debts. My blood ran cold. How much money, to whom? This was new. Another secret, another mess I was expected to clean up. So this isn't just about an investment, is it? I looked from Mark's pale face to Daniel's suddenly guarded expression to Chloe's anxious one. This is about bailing Mark out again and using my house to do it. It's a sound investment regardless, Daniel insisted, his voice rising slightly. Mark's situation just adds urgency. And whose fault is Mark's situation? I asked, the years of frustration finally bubbling over. How many times have I helped? How many times have I dipped into my savings, put off my own needs? That's not fair, Mom, Chloe snapped, her cheeks flushed. We're family, we help each other. Do we? I challenged, my voice trembling slightly. Or do I just help you? The air crackled with tension. Diners at nearby tables glanced over. Daniel leaned back, adopting an air of wounded reason. Margaret, we appreciate everything you do, truly. But sometimes it feels like you hold it over us. Like you enjoy being the martyr. That stung, deeply. And frankly, Chloe added, her voice dropping but the words hitting me like stones, living with you, managing your needs, the upkeep on that huge place, sometimes, Mom, honestly, it makes you a bit of a burden. There it was, the word hanging in the air, ugly and final. A burden. Not the provider, not the protector, not the mother who had given everything. A burden, my breath hitched. I looked at their faces, Chloe's defensive pout, Daniel's calculated neutrality, Mark's miserable avoidance. None of them flinched. None of them took it back. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. It solidified into a cold, sharp clarity. They didn't see me. They saw an obstacle, an asset to be exploited, a burden to be managed. The waiter arrived with the bill, placing it pointedly in the center of the table. Daniel made no move towards it. Chloe stared fixedly at her wine glass. Mark looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Habit ingrained over decades almost made me reach for it. My hand actually twitched. But then I looked at their expectant, entitled faces. A burden, fine. Let them carry their own weight for a change. I stood up, my chair scraping softly against the floor. I see, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Well, enjoy your dinner. And I walked away, leaving them staring, mouths agape at the bill sitting accusingly between them. The walk home that night felt different. The air was cold, biting at my cheeks, but inside a strange fire had been lit. The hurt was immense, a physical ache in my chest, but beneath it something else was stirring, resolve. The word burden played on repeat, each echo chipping away another layer of misplaced loyalty, another shard of maternal guilt I'd carried for far too long. A burden, was I? Because I wouldn't sign away my only security for a risky scheme designed to bail out my perpetually irresponsible son and line my manipulative son-in-law's pockets. Because I maintained the roof over their heads, the roof they now saw only as untapped equity. Because I paid the property taxes, the insurance, the never-ending repairs that a house of that age demanded, all while they spent their money on luxuries and fleeting ventures. The sheer, breathtaking injustice of it settled deep in my bones. For years I had tiptoed around their egos, minimized my own needs, accepted their casual disregard as the price of family harmony. I'd swallowed complaints, absorbed financial shocks, mediated their squabbles, always playing the peacemaker, the stable center. And for what? To be dismissed as a weight holding them back. The house, bathed in the cool moonlight as I approached, seemed to watch me, its familiar silhouette both a comfort and a cage. How many nights had I lain awake in that house, worrying about them? Worrying about bills, about their futures, about their happiness? How much of my own life had been consumed by their needs, their dramas, their expectations? The lights were on downstairs. Through the bay window, I could see them, outlines moving, probably arguing about the restaurant bill, about my abrupt departure, about their thwarted plans. Anger surged, cold and clean. Not the hot, messy anger that leads to shouting matches, but a deeper, steadier fury. The anger of realizing you've been profoundly, fundamentally undervalued by the very people you cherished most. That night sleep eluded me. I sat in the dark in my own room, the smallest one, the one I'd taken after Daniel annexed the larger spare room, and I thought. I thought about Robert's hidden debts and the lonely struggle afterwards. I thought about Chloe's casual assumption that I would fund her wedding, Daniel's constant probing about my finances, Mark's endless cycle of crises. I thought about the loans, the favors, the emotional energy I'd poured into them, receiving so little in return besides the occasional, condescending pat on the head. A burden. The word had become a key, unlocking a door I hadn't even realized was closed. A door to a future where I wasn't responsible for their mistakes, where my home was my own, where my peace of mind wasn't contingent on their approval. The decision wasn't instantaneous, not a lightning strike, but a slow dawn breaking over a desolate landscape. It started as a flicker. What if? What if I wasn't there to catch them? What if I stopped enabling them? What if I put myself first for once in decades? The flicker grew into a flame. I deserved better. I deserved peace. I deserved to live in my own home without feeling like an intruder, without my security being viewed as a commodity. By morning, the decision was made. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about self-preservation. It was about reclaiming my life. They saw me as a burden, fine. I would remove that burden completely. And they could finally learn what it truly meant to stand on their own 2 feet, weighed down only by the consequences of their own choices. The first step was quiet, almost invisible. I started gathering my important documents, the deed to the house, my birth certificate, my parents' wills, my own financial statements, the few personal treasures that truly mattered. I packed them into a sturdy box hidden at the back of my wardrobe. Each item felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they hadn't managed to touch or tarnish. Then came the harder part, untangling the financial threads. Daniel, in his role as the family's unofficial and unqualified financial guru, had access to far too much information. He'd helped me consolidate bills years ago, set up online accounts he had passwords for, always under the guise of making things easier for me. Easier for him to monitor, I now realized. I spent hours online changing passwords, moving the modest savings I'd managed to squirrel away into new accounts at a different bank, accounts he knew nothing about. It felt clandestine, almost illicit, but also incredibly empowering. Every password changed, every statement redirected to a new P.O. box I'd rented was a step towards freedom. The biggest hurdle was the house itself. It was in my name, solely mine, but they lived there. Evicting my own children felt monstrous. Yet letting them continue to treat my home as their personal bank account, while viewing me as an inconvenience within its walls, was no longer sustainable. I thought about Daniel's investment property scheme, his desire to leverage the equity. What if I leveraged it first, not for some risky venture, but for my own escape? I made a discreet appointment with a financial advisor at the new bank, someone unconnected to Daniel or his firm. Mrs. Davies was sharp, empathetic, and blessedly practical. I laid out the situation, the ownership of the house, my desire to leave, my children's financial dependence, and their recent burden comment. I didn't cry, but my voice shook recounting that dinner. She listened patiently, her expression understanding. You own the house outright, she confirmed, looking at the deed. Yes, my parents left it to me. And your children and son-in-law live there rent-free while pressuring you to finance their ventures and debts using the house as collateral. Essentially, yes, she tapped her pen. And they recently referred to you as a burden? My daughter did. The others agreed implicitly. Mrs. Davies nodded slowly. Margaret, you have options. Difficult options perhaps, but options nonetheless. You could sell the house, split the proceeds if you felt generous, though legally you aren't obligated to. Or, she paused, you could secure a line of credit against the equity yourself. Use it to set yourself up somewhere else. Let them deal with the consequences of the property remaining. What consequences? Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities. If you're not living there and you make it clear you are no longer financially responsible for the household, those bills will fall to the occupants. And if they can't or won't pay, the house could go into foreclosure. The thought was terrifying yet freeing. Eventually, yes, or they'd be forced to find a way to cover the costs, perhaps by finally getting serious about their own finances. She explained the process for a home equity line of credit, HELOC. It felt strange borrowing against the home I'd guarded so fiercely. But this wasn't for them. This was for me. It was my escape fund, my severance package from a family that no longer valued me. I applied for a modest HELOC, enough to cover moving expenses, a deposit on a small apartment, and a cushion for a few months while I found my feet. The approval came through quietly, the funds accessible only by me. While this was happening, life at home continued with a strained, artificial normality. Chloe and Daniel were cool towards me, polite but distant, clearly furious about my refusal to fund their scheme. Mark was sullen and withdrawn, avoiding me entirely. They seemed to be waiting for me to crack, to apologize, to cave as I always had before. They mistook my quiet planning for defeat, my calm demeanor for resignation. The irony was delicious. They thought I was passively accepting my role as the burdensome matriarch, while I was actively orchestrating my departure. I started discreetly packing personal belongings, things they wouldn't notice missing immediately: old photo albums, my mother's jewelry, books, clothes I hadn't worn recently. I stored the boxes at a small unit I rented under my own name. Each trip felt like smuggling contraband, my heart pounding, but my resolve hardening. The house itself seemed to sigh around me, heavy with unspoken words, saturated with years of compromise. Looking at the worn patch on the armchair where I always sat, the scratches on the floor from Chloe's childhood roller skates, the faint pencil marks on the doorframe measuring their heights, ghosts of a happier time, or perhaps just a time when the dysfunction was better hidden. Leaving wasn't just about escaping them, it was about leaving behind the person I had become in that house. The perpetual giver, the silent fixer, the woman slowly erasing herself for the sake of others. They called me a burden. They had no idea the true burden was the weight of their expectations, their entitlement, their ingratitude, and I was finally ready to put it down. The final piece was the bill, not just one, but the cumulative weight of their financial dependencies. There was the outstanding balance on the shared credit card I'd foolishly agreed to years ago, supposedly for household emergencies, which had somehow ballooned with Daniel's online shopping and Mark's unexplained cash withdrawals. There were the property taxes, due in 2 months, a significant sum I always paid from my own account. And then there was the consolidated loan I'd recently discovered Mark had taken out using easily forged electronic signatures on documents Daniel had helped him prepare online. Listing the house address and implying residency gave him some claim, a desperate measure after I refused the HELOC for the duplex scheme. The bank for that loan had sent letters, increasingly urgent, which I'd intercepted before Mark or Daniel saw them. It was a tangled mess designed, consciously or not, to keep me tethered, to keep me paying. Untangling it completely wasn't possible without confrontation, which I now knew was pointless. So I made another decision. I wouldn't untangle it, I would simply cut the knot. I paid the minimum on the credit card one last time, then called the company, reported my card lost, and requested a new one sent to my P.O. box, freezing the old number. I let the property tax bill sit on the pile of mail I no longer sorted for them. And the loan Mark had fraudulently secured? I contacted the lending institution, explained I was the sole owner of the property listed, that I had not authorized any such loan, and provided copies of the deed and my identification, requesting they investigate the signatory. I made it clear I would not be responsible for its repayment. Let them chase Mark. Let Daniel explain his role in helping with the application. That was their mess now. The day I chose to leave was intentionally ordinary. A Tuesday. Chloe and Daniel were at work. Mark was supposedly job hunting, which usually meant sleeping until noon. I moved with quiet efficiency, loading the last few boxes into my aging car. It wasn't much. Decades of living seemed to shrink down to what could fit in the back seat and trunk. Sentimental items, practical necessities, documents proving my independence. The house felt cavernous and silent. I walked through the rooms one last time. The living room, dominated by Daniel's oversized television and sound system. The kitchen, where I'd cooked thousands of meals, its counters cluttered with their perpetually unwashed dishes. Chloe's room, still filled with remnants of her teenage years mixed with her current expensive tastes. Mark's attic escape, smelling faintly of stale pizza and desperation. My own small room, already stripped bare. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stage set for a play I was no longer performing in. On the polished mahogany table in the entryway, a piece my mother had loved, I left 2 things. An envelope addressed simply to Chloe, Daniel, and Mark. Inside, there wasn't a long, tearful letter. No explanations, no accusations beyond the necessary. Just the final demand notice for Mark's fraudulent loan, the latest overdue notice for the shared credit card, a copy of the upcoming property tax bill, and a simple typed note. You referred to me as a burden. I have decided to remove that burden from your lives. The enclosed are now your responsibility. The house, as you know, is mine, but I will not be residing here or covering its expenses any longer. Figure it out. The second item I left was the key. Not my key, but the spare key Daniel had made without asking, the one he kept just in case. I placed it squarely on top of the envelope, a symbolic return of access they had taken for granted. I didn't look back as I closed the front door softly behind me. The click of the lock echoed in the sudden quiet. Sitting in my car, I took a deep breath. There was no elation, not yet, just a profound, hollowed-out sense of relief. The engine turned over with a familiar grumble, a loyal sound in a world that had felt increasingly treacherous. As I pulled away from the curb, I didn't check the rearview mirror. There was nothing back there I needed to see. The road ahead was uncertain, leading to a small, sparsely furnished apartment in a neighborhood I barely knew. But it was mine. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, so was my life. The burden was lifted. Now it was their turn to carry it. The silence at first was deafening. I'd braced myself for an immediate explosion, frantic calls, angry texts, perhaps even showing up on my temporary doorstep, though how they'd find me I wasn't sure. But days turned into a week and my phone remained stubbornly quiet. Part of me, the old, conditioned part, felt a pang of worry. Were they okay? Had something happened? The other, newer, stronger part knew this silence was strategic. They were likely stunned, then furious, then calculating. Daniel especially would be weighing options, trying to figure out the angle, the way to turn this back on me to regain control. The lack of immediate contact suggested they hadn't grasped the full implications yet. They probably thought I was bluffing, throwing a tantrum, expecting me to crawl back, apologetic, ready to smooth things over as always. They underestimated the finality of that word, burden. It wasn't just an insult, it was a release. It severed the invisible chains of obligation I'd worn for so long. My new apartment was small, basic, with generic beige walls and a view of a brick building. But it was clean, it was quiet, and it was entirely mine. I unpacked my few boxes, arranging my mother's figurines on the windowsill, hanging familiar pictures on the unfamiliar walls. It felt light. I started exploring the neighborhood, finding a local library, a small park, a friendly coffee shop where the barista learned my name. Simple pleasures I hadn't had time or energy for in years. I even started looking into part-time work, not out of desperation, but out of a desire to engage, to build something new just for myself. About 10 days after I left, the first tentative contact arrived. A text message from Chloe. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk." No apology, no concern, just need. I looked at the message for a long time, the familiar tug of duty warring with my newfound resolve. I typed and deleted several replies before settling on a simple, neutral one. "I'm fine, Chloe, I'm taking some time for myself." Her reply was almost instantaneous. "Time for yourself? What about us? What about the house? There are bills arriving, Mom, serious ones." "Yes, I know," I typed back. "As I said in my note, they are your responsibility now." The 3 dots indicating she was typing appeared and disappeared several times. Finally, "That's ridiculous, you can't just walk away. Mark is freaking out about some loan company calling him." "Mark took out the loan, Chloe, he needs to deal with it." "Daniel says you sabotaged us. He says you called the credit card company and froze the account. How could you do that?" "Sabotaged them." The word choice was pure Daniel, framing my self-preservation as an attack. "I protected myself, Chloe, that card was being misused." "This is insane, you have to come home, we need to sort this out." "Daniel is trying to figure out the property tax situation, it's a huge amount." "I won't be coming home. The house and its expenses are yours to manage." I put the phone down, my hand trembling slightly. The ingrained urge to fix, to soothe, was strong. But the memory of their faces at that restaurant, the cold finality of burden, was stronger. This was the consequence they hadn't foreseen. They thought my value lay solely in my assets and my willingness to provide. They never considered the value of my presence, my management, my absorption of life's tedious, expensive details. A few days later, a registered letter arrived at my P.O. box, forwarded from the old address. It was from a law firm representing Daniel and Chloe. My stomach plummeted. Legal threats already? I opened it with trepidation. It wasn't exactly a threat, more of a formal, jargon-filled request for mediation regarding the shared familial residence and associated financial obligations. It spoke of my precipitous departure and the undue hardship caused. It was Daniel's fingerprints all over it, attempting to frame their entitlement in legalistic terms, painting me as the unreasonable party abandoning my duties. Undue hardship. The phrase almost made me laugh. What about the decades of undue hardship I had shouldered? Mrs. Davies, my financial advisor, had recommended a lawyer specializing in property and family disputes just in case. I called her. Attorney Miller was calm, professional, and reassuringly unimpressed by the letter's tone. "Standard posturing," she said after I read it to her. "They're trying to intimidate you into returning to the status quo. Your name is solely on the deed?" "Yes, absolutely." "And you have documentation of the financial support you've provided over the years?" And the circumstances of your departure, specifically the burden comment? I have bank statements, receipts for major repairs, and I clearly remember the conversation. Good, we can draft a response making your position clear. You are the owner, you are not obligated to house them or pay their expenses. Any funds they are demanding relate to debts they incurred themselves, one possibly fraudulently. We state firmly that you have vacated the property, and they are now tenants at will, responsible for all ongoing costs if they choose to remain. We can also mention the potential legal issues surrounding that loan Mark took out. Hearing it laid out so clinically, so legally, solidified my resolve further. This wasn't just an emotional battle anymore. It was about asserting my rights. The rights I had unknowingly sacrificed for years. My lawyer's response must have landed like a lead balloon. Because the next communication wasn't a letter. It was Mark, showing up unexpectedly outside my apartment building one evening as I returned from the library. He looked awful, haggard, pale, his usual air of nonchalant drifting replaced by raw panic. He must have waited for hours, guessing which apartment complex I might have chosen based on proximity to my P.O. box or some other clue. Seeing him there ambushing me sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, but also a wave of pity I had to fight down. Mom, he started, his voice cracking. Mom, you have to help me. I stayed on the public sidewalk, my library books clutched like a shield. Hello, Mark, what is it? This loan thing they're calling constantly. They're talking about wage garnishment, legal action, I could lose my job, the one I just started. He had a new job, that was news, but the desperation was familiar. Mark, you took out that loan. I know I messed up, but Daniel said it would be okay. He said we could handle it with the duplex investment. His voice trailed off. Blaming Daniel, of course. The investment I refused to fund with my house. I reminded him gently but firmly. Yeah, well, things got out of hand, Mom, please, just this once. Can you talk to them? Co-sign a repayment plan, something? Just this once. How many times had I heard that phrase? How many just this once moments had bled into years of enabling? No, Mark, I said, the word tasting less bitter this time, more like simple truth. I can't. I told you in the note those responsibilities are yours now. You are an adult. You need to face the consequences of your actions. He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. But you always help. I did, I agreed. And it didn't help you, did it? It just taught you that I would always be there to clean up the mess. It's time you learned to clean up your own. Tears welled in his eyes, real tears of fear and desperation. It tore at me, the maternal instinct screaming to pull him close, to promise I'd fix it. I held my ground. What about the house? He asked, his voice thick. Chloe and Daniel are going crazy. The property tax bill is enormous. They can't cover it, not with the mortgage payment they thought they'd have from the duplex and everything else. The house isn't mortgaged, Mark, I said patiently. It's paid for. The only bills are the ones associated with living there, taxes, insurance, utilities, upkeep, and the debts you all accumulated. But we can't afford it, he cried, gesturing wildly. Daniel's freaking out, his commissions are down. Chloe's blaming him, he's blaming her, they're fighting all the time. It's awful. A tiny, vindictive part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was quickly overshadowed by weariness. This was their cycle, their chaos, and I was finally out of its orbit. Then perhaps, I suggested calmly, you all need to make some different choices. Maybe Daniel needs to cut back on his expenses. Maybe Chloe needs to understand the real cost of things. Maybe you need to stick with this new job and create a budget. Maybe you all need to find somewhere cheaper to live. Cheaper? Where would we go? We'd be homeless. The hyperbole was typical. That's unlikely, Mark, but staying in a large, expensive house you can't afford isn't sustainable. That's the reality you all refused to see when I was paying for it. He looked utterly defeated, slumped against the brick wall of my building. So you're really not coming back? You're really leaving us with all this? I'm not leaving you with anything, Mark. I'm leaving you with the results of your own choices and actions. There's a difference. I needed to end this. It was draining, standing on a public street arguing with my distraught son. I have to go in now. He didn't move to block me, just stared at the pavement. They called you a burden, he mumbled, almost too quiet to hear. I heard them. I didn't say anything. I'm sorry, Mom. It was the first hint of genuine remorse I'd heard from any of them. It was small, buried under his own panic, but it was there. Thank you for saying that, Mark, I said softly. But it doesn't change anything. I hope you figure things out. Truly I do, but you have to do it without me. I turned and walked into the building, not looking back, the key card feeling heavy in my hand. The encounter left me shaken but resolute. Mark's desperation, Chloe's entitled texts, Daniel's legal maneuvering, it all stemmed from the same root, their utter unpreparedness for reality. They had lived in a bubble I created, a bubble of financial security and consequence-free living, and now that bubble had burst. The calls started coming more frequently after that. Chloe sometimes crying, sometimes yelling. Daniel trying to reason then threat, his smooth charm cracking under the strain. I screened the calls, letting most go to voicemail. The messages were a predictable mix of guilt trips. How can you abandon your family? Accusations, you planned this to ruin us. Please, Mom, please, we can work this out. and veiled threats, "You'll regret this. There are legal avenues." I listened to them dispassionately, like studying specimens under a microscope. The emotional hooks that used to snag me now felt blunt. Attorney Miller handled the formal communications. She reiterated my position. The house was mine, they were welcome to vacate or assume full financial responsibility if they stayed. She also pointed out that any attempt to claim hardship would be countered by evidence of their lifestyle and Mark's fraudulently obtained loan, suggesting litigation would likely be unfavorable and costly for them. This seemed to dampen the legal threats, at least for a while. News trickled in indirectly. My old neighbor Martha called one afternoon ostensibly to ask about a garden plant but really to gossip. "Oh, Margaret," she'd sighed, "things seem awfully tense over at your place. Lots of shouting matches drifting over the fence. And that lovely son-in-law of yours, Daniel, saw him arguing with some repo men the other day over that fancy sports car he drives. Or drove, I suppose." So the financial cracks were becoming visible chasms. Daniel's carefully constructed image was crumbling. Martha also mentioned seeing for sale signs go up briefly on neighboring houses, only to be taken down again. Perhaps they were exploring cheaper options but couldn't qualify for a mortgage or find anything that met their inflated expectations. They were trapped partly by circumstance, but mostly by their own refusal to adapt. The house, my former sanctuary, had become their gilded cage. The foreclosure notice I'd anticipated finally arrived at my P.O. box, a copy sent to the owner of record. They hadn't paid the property taxes. The county was initiating proceedings. It wasn't a surprise, but seeing it in black and white still felt significant. This was the end game I had set in motion, not out of malice but out of necessity. They had called me a burden. Now the actual burden of their lifestyle, the house they took for granted, was crushing them. I forwarded a copy to Attorney Miller with instructions to inform their lawyer, if they still had one, that I would not be intervening. The house's fate was now tied to their ability and willingness to rectify the situation, something I suspected was far beyond their capacity. The call I finally decided to answer came from Chloe late one evening. Her voice was flat, devoid of the usual drama or entitlement, just weary. "Mom, yes, Chloe, we got the notice about the taxes, the foreclosure. I received a copy." A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the faint static on the line. "We can't pay it, Mom, we just can't. Daniel lost his job last month. Something about misrepresenting funds, I don't know. Mark's loan people are garnishing most of his wages from the warehouse job he hates. We're broke." There was no accusation in her tone this time, just a bleak statement of fact. It was the first time I'd ever heard her sound truly defeated, stripped of the bravado and blame. "I see," I said softly. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Daniel wants to declare bankruptcy. Mark is talking about moving into his car. I guess we have to move out. Find some cheap apartment somewhere if anyone will rent to us now." The image of them scattered, broken, should have felt like victory. It didn't, it just felt sad, the inevitable consequence of years of poor choices culminating in this final preventable disaster. "That sounds like a difficult situation, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice even. "Yes," she said, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her. "Yeah, it is, it's funny." "What's funny?" "All those years. We thought the house was the answer. Security, equity, our future. We thought you were just standing in the way, being difficult." Her voice trembled slightly. "We never realized you were the security, not the house. You were the one holding everything together, paying for everything, fixing everything." A tear slid down my cheek, hot and unexpected. It wasn't a tear of pity but of acknowledgement. Finally, someone had finally seen it. "And we called you a burden," she continued, her voice thick with regret. "God, Mom, we were the burden all along, weren't we?" I couldn't speak for a moment, the raw honesty of her admission hitting me harder than any anger or accusation ever could. "Yes, Chloe," I finally managed to say, my own voice choked. "Yes, you were." Another silence, but this one felt different. Less like a chasm, more like a space for understanding. "So," she said, her voice regaining a semblance of practicality though tinged with sadness. "We'll be out by the end of the month, before the first auction date. I don't know what you want to do with the place." "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "I'll talk to my lawyer about the proceedings." "Okay," she said quietly. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything." It wasn't a magic wand. It didn't erase years of hurt or entitlement. But it was a start, a crack in the facade. "Thank you, Chloe," I said again. "Take care of yourself." "You too, Mom." We hung up. I sat there in the quiet of my small apartment, the city lights painting patterns on the wall, and I let myself cry. Not for them, not entirely. But for the family we had been, the potential squandered, the love warped by resentment and greed. And for the mother I had been, the one who had loved them enough to finally let them fall, hoping, praying, they might learn to stand up on their own. The house eventually went to auction. Attorney Miller handled the process. After the outstanding taxes and fees were settled, there was a small amount left over. Enough for me to replenish my savings, create a more stable emergency fund. I didn't offer any of it to Chloe, Daniel, or Mark. That chapter was closed. My neighbor Martha reported that they moved into separate, small apartments in less desirable parts of town. Daniel apparently was struggling to find work in finance again. Mark was still at the warehouse, grumbling but showing up. Chloe had taken a second job as a waitress. They weren't thriving, but they were surviving, paying their own bills, living within their means, perhaps for the first time ever. We didn't talk often, occasional tentative texts on birthdays or holidays. Chloe called sometimes, her updates brief, carefully avoiding any requests for help. There was a new distance, respectful but sad. The old dynamic, the one where I was the ever-present safety net and they were the perpetual dependents, was irrevocably broken. Sometimes, walking through the park near my apartment, seeing families together, I felt a pang of loss. The dream of a close-knit family, growing old, surrounded by loving children and grandchildren, that dream had died. But then I would sit on a bench, feel the sun on my face, listen to the city's hum without the underlying thrum of anxiety about their next crisis, and a different feeling would wash over me: peace. It was a quiet peace, hard one, carrying the scars of betrayal and disappointment, but it was mine. I was no longer defined by their needs, their demands, their perception of me. I wasn't just mom, the fixer, the provider, I was Margaret. A woman rediscovering herself, finding strength in solitude, building a life on her own terms. They had called me a burden. But in leaving them with the bills, the mortgage mess, the collapsing structure of their entitled lives, I had finally shed the true burden, the weight of their expectations. And in doing so, I had finally found my own freedom. It was a bittersweet freedom, yes, but freedom nonetheless. And it was worth everything.